Since 2006, May has been designated the Jewish American Heritage Month. While we are still in April, I'm delighted that Amy will be setting us off by presenting her talk titled Realigning Faith, American Jews, Protestants, and Israel, 1945 to 2000, that will explore the relationship that American Jewish community cultivated with American organizations, especially evangelical Christian and other Protestant groups in its interreligious work. This is an apt time to study this history, and we're grateful that Amy will be sharing her research with us. Amy Weiss holds the Maurice Greenberg Chair in Judaic Studies and is Assistant Professor of Judaic Studies and History at the University of Hartford. During 2022-2023 academic year, she has also served as a faculty fellow in ethnic studies at the UHart Center for Humanities, and is with us as a Center for Jewish Studies Fordham Research Fellow. She previously held Thomas and Elissa Ellant Katz Fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania's Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. Her research and publications focus on the intersection of American Jewish history, Israeli culture, Jewish-Protestant relations. She's currently writing a book on evolving relationships and American Jewish communal organizations have forged with evangelicals on issues relating to Israel. Most recently, her articles have appeared in journals of American Jewish history, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and Israel Studies, and several edited volumes, and we will share some of that in the follow-up newsletter on Monday. So look out for this in your mailboxes. Amy, welcome. Thank you for sharing your work with us today. And those of you who are online, please use the Q&A button for questions and comments, and we will get to as many of them as possible. So Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Magda. It is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Fordham Center for Jewish Studies as well as the Center for Jewish History for hosting me. It's such a pleasure to be able to conduct research, and 4 weeks is definitely not enough. I know that I will be back both at Fordham and Center for Jewish History this summer looking for more, right? There's for those of you who conduct research, you know that once you get into the archives, it's a great place to be, and sometimes you don't necessarily want to leave, but obviously with writing a book, there's a time to end and to start writing. So for today, just to give some background, I'll be talking.
Just want to get rid of this.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Great, so for today, I'm looking at this relationship that Jews and evangelicals have forged, and specifically, I should say, Jewish communal organizations, that the conversations that I'll be mentioning that Jews and evangelicals were having, for the most part today, I'll be talking about communal organizations. And not all Jews supported interfaith relationships, and for those that did, they saw them in a variety of ways and understood them for their own personal reasons. And we'll see how that plays out with these organizations. So we'll look at, essentially, today you often think about the Christian right, Christian Zionism, but how did we get here? This question about Jews and evangelicals, question about evangelicals in Israel, how did this form? And so much of my research and the talk for today will highlight, I hope, how Jews and evangelicals forged this relationship. And some of the examples that we'll look at are the 1970 film called His Land. You can take a guess as whose His Land might refer to. We'll discuss it. And we'll also look at, so it's a film produced by the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, and we'll look at how American Jewish communal organizations responded, both favorably and not so favorably. We'll turn to the awarding in 1977 of Billy Graham, perhaps the foremost evangelist of the 20th century. he received a 1977 National Interreligious Award. And it's of note that it was not given to a liberal Protestant or a Catholic, but specifically to an evangelical. And lastly, we'll conclude by looking at the significance of Israel's role or the role of Israel in Jewish evangelical relations. So to start, I wanted to look at, well, we have this image here from the World Congress on Evangelism taking place in Berlin in 1966. And so perhaps an interesting place to start when we're talking about Jews, the World Congress of Evangelism. But I would argue that here it's hosted by Billy Graham, and it's also hosted by Carl Henry, the editor of Christianity Today, an evangelical magazine. And just some more background. So about 1,200 individuals from all over the globe. There was a heavy preponderance of Americans at this conference in Berlin. And essentially, I have this quotation here, they were meeting to make an urgent appeal to the world church to return to the dynamic zeal for world evangelization. And this is a meeting of like-minded individuals, and perhaps I should walk that back. Like-minded, perhaps in some aspects. They agreed on this idea of evangelization, but a question perhaps on how to go about doing that, or how they felt about human rights, civil rights. That might be different depending upon the denomination to which the individuals belonged and their own personal beliefs. But I bring this up because Rabbi Arthur Gilbert, a Reconstructionist rabbi, and perhaps more importantly for my research, the director of the Anti-Defamation League's Department of Religious Research, attended as a guest of Graham. And here, Arthur Gilbert was shown every possible door. It was open to him. He met with different leaders in the evangelical world, and he came away with this idea of thinking Jewish-Christian relations, specifically with evangelicals, it's not completely a foregone conclusion that this can't happen. And here I have this quotation from Graham, that this is how he began the conference. And I think that's really significant. He's beginning the conference by saying, of the Jewish people, we ask for forgiveness. Again, a really interesting way of starting a conference on evangelicalism and evangelism. Of the Jewish people, we ask forgiveness. We must remember that our Savior was born of a Jewish mother, and it is to this people that we owe our Bible. And so, while you might argue with the ultimate end goal of why is Graham saying this, nonetheless, he's making note that he recognizes that within Christianity, and perhaps with evangelical Christianity, that there have been ideologies about Jews, about the nature of the second coming and the role that Jews play in that. So Graham was very particular to make sure that the conference is starting on this note of understanding. And Rabbi Arthur Gilbert saw this as a sign that perhaps things have started to change in terms of how Jews perceived evangelicals and perhaps of how evangelicals perceived of Jews. And the conversation that was started in Berlin in 1966 continued the following year. In 1967, Graham again invited Arthur Gilbert to his home in North Carolina. And here they continue the conversations that were started, talking about the Middle East, talking about civil rights, talking about ideologies, school prayer, questions about church and state separation. And this quotation, although it applies to Arthur Gilbert's understanding of evangelicals from 1966, he declares that evangelicals are no longer inaccessible to dialogue. The door is at least open, he concluded, and it has been opened in large measure from inside. And it's during this 1967 meeting that Gilbert doubles down and says, it's true. After these meetings, I really feel strongly that evangelicals are open to dialogue. And right, this idea that it's been opened in large measure from the inside, meaning that Billy Graham and other leaders have supported this idea of working with evangelicals. Now, to be clear, and I mentioned this at the beginning, and I'll mention it at the end, that this focus on Jewish-Christian relations, it's for very specific purposes. On the one hand, these individuals believe in interfaith dialogue, but the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, I'll mention Hadassah, they also see this as very particular to their own political agenda, their own organizational needs. So it's not necessarily, and just as in any relationship, is it out of the goodness of their own hearts? Maybe, but it's also because they have their own agenda that they're looking to accomplish. And so here I wanted to highlight that these are several moments in a much larger discussion of how Jews and evangelicals are growing together, and it's sometimes growing apart. But it's these very small moments. So a Reconstructionist rabbi from the ADL attending a conference in Berlin on evangelism, of having these one-on-one meetings, of having larger meetings. The American Jewish Committee is bringing Billy Graham, bringing other leaders of the evangelical world to have one-on-one meetings, to hear what they have to say. And as these one-on-one meetings are taking place, the organizations are starting to think, well, how can we grow this? How can we develop this on a larger scale? And before I even go any further, it's important to say that, well, what type of relationships were these organizations having before? And Jewish organizations on the whole were looking towards liberal Protestants, that they saw them as individuals who often had the same political ideologies, perhaps the same questions when it came to the civil rights movement, when it came to women's rights, church-state separation, that they saw these individuals, liberal Protestants, as partners. And it's a question of, well, why did that change? Why did, and again, this is not every single organization, but why did many, starting in the late 1960s and 1970s, start to reconsider who their partners, or at least who their go-to partners would be, the ones that in times of positive relationships and in times of struggle, that these would be the partners that they looked to. And part of the answer has to do with both real and perceived questions about Israel. So relating to the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, there was this concern among Jewish organizations, Jewish individuals, that liberal Protestants were silenced. And looking at the records from different denominational organizations, looking at the liberal Protestants publications, there were entire dialogues for months after the June War. Was there a response? How could you have a response in 6 days? How can you get an entire denomination to respond and have one voice? And anyone who's been part of a committee, a larger committee, a bureaucracy, it is very difficult to get a consensus and to get one quickly. But at the same time, this question of, was that a factor of bureaucracy, or was that a question of indifference? Was that a question of concerns that liberal Protestants had about how their view of Israel was shifting? Previously, often seeing it as a humanitarian endeavor, to this idea that a Jewish state was born, but also at the question for them, at what cost? What about Palestinian refugees? What about their own interests in missionary work in Israel and the larger Middle East? So just to give this context of liberal Protestants and Jews, and also Jews and Catholics, although for my research that's further afield, but this question of, as liberal Protestants are starting to question Israeli government policies, and also I won't talk about it today, but Jews are also questioning Israeli government policies. But this question of, as liberal Protestants are starting to question, and as their numbers are starting to dwindle, you have this interesting shift that's taking place starting in the 1960s, where liberal Protestants, their numbers are decreasing, evangelicals, their numbers are increasing. They're increasingly going from the subculture to the mainstream. And this question is how to harness this political strength. And so part of that we can see that takes place in this 1969 Jewish Baptist Conference. So both in this year, 1969, the American Jewish Committee as well as the Anti-Defamation League both have Jewish Baptist conferences. And here, this description of what this conference is about, I think is really telling. So we're told that before Baptists and Jews can serve others, however, they first need to know each other. The stereotypes and mythologies that have prevailed between both communities need to be confronted and challenged by realities and truths. The similarities in shared religious and moral beliefs should be clarified and examined. The vital differences on which Baptists and Jews stake their lives should be understood in order that differences can be made a source of ironic enrichment rather than of polemic estrangement. To the realization of these purposes, consultation is hopefully dedicated. The Southern Baptist Convention and the American Jewish Committee join in prayer that God will bless the work of the hands of the participants in this pioneer national undertaking who make Baptist Jewish living history by their very first meeting together. So here you have members of the American Jewish Committee, mainly rabbis, mainly individuals living in the Northeast, meeting with members of the Southern Baptist Convention, individuals who are religious leaders and mainly living in the South. So we also not only have Jews and evangelicals who literally these individuals have never met, but in some cases, Jews have never met evangelicals and evangelicals have never met Jews. And also geographically, who might be their neighbors be? Who are they running into in the grocery store? And because of their geographic difference, this is something that often hasn't happened. So this conference, along with the ADL conference that takes place the same year, is very significant. And just for this idea of, oh, the survey questions, how did you feel about this conference? What did you learn? And every individual responded, I had no idea that I could have a dialogue with a Southern Baptist. I had no idea that I could talk to a Jew and that we actually shared something in common. And so at this conference, they had 5 different themes, Israel being one of them in terms, and each, there would be a Baptist talk on Israel, a Jewish talk, trying to see if there's any common ground, right? This idea, let's talk about the differences later, but let's see if we can, if there's anything shared between us. And so this became, if not somewhat annual conference, it became an annual tradition of meeting with Jews and Baptists to, and then more specifically, evangelicals from other denominations, to see how each group collectively could work together to further their own agendas. And so here this takes me to, again, just skipping through some different highlights in this growing relationship between Jewish communal organizations and evangelicals. So on the heels of the successful 1969 conference, the American Jewish Committee decides to support the promotion of the musical documentary, His Land. So this is made in 1970. It's produced by Worldwide Pictures, a subsidiary of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. And so perhaps it is what it sounds like, this musical documentary where you have Cliff Richards and Cliff Barrows walking through the streets of Tel Aviv, but they are also visiting sites in the Galilee, visiting sites in the Negev, and on film, showing viewers at home what Israel looks like. And here, so this is one of, these are some of the lyrics for the song His Land, also the name of the film. Yes, it is his land, all of it his. He stepped it off and marked it there, stepped it off and marked it there, to be his earthly thoroughfare. And he blessed it with his hand. Yes, it's a great land, all of it is. And as it blooms before our eyes, just like an Eden paradise, the world will understand this is his land. Now, this question of, well, whose land are we talking about, right? I'm hesitant to say, well, clearly we know who his land is, but right, we're talking about Jesus. We're talking about this idea of questions of the second coming. And I should say, before I go any further, that there are two versions of this film made. One version was maybe about 5 to 10 minutes longer, and at the end of the film, viewers were invited to accept Jesus into their lives. And in the shorter version, that part is removed. Now, you might ask, if there is a film that's talking about his land, the land of Israel, right, this connection to Jesus, why would the American Jewish Committee decide that this is a movie that they want to promote? And here, this is a letter from Mark Tannenbaum, the Director of Interreligious Affairs for the American Jewish Committee. And this is one thing that he has to say. I find it hard to come by words adequate to express our appreciation for the tremendous contribution that you and your associates have made in helping the Christian community understand the deep spiritual and historic importance of the land and the state of Israel, both to Judaism and Christianity. And here he's talking about through the use of his land. While we may differ, obviously, about certain fundamentals, there is no question in my mind that the love and deep emotional empathy that is contained in this film for the Jewish people in Israel will contribute to strengthening profoundly the bonds between Christians and Jews. Again, a really interesting take. But I will say that at the same time that Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum is praising this film, saying that this film has had such a positive impact, not only on American support for Israel, but also in how Jews and Christians can relate to one another and can understand Israel. He also writes several memos to the ADL chapter, or excuse me, the American Jewish Committee chapters, and says, only watch this film if you understand that its message is not for you, right? So Mark Tannenbaum is very much aware that this film is geared towards an evangelical audience. But at the same time, Mark Tannenbaum is willing to say, I recognize that, but what positive work is it doing for Jews and for Israel? On the flip side, the Anti-Defamation League, this film, they say they're asked to promote it as well, and they say no, that this film is not something that we think is going to promote Jewish-Christian relations. And we also understand, as Mark Tannenbaum said, its message is not for Jews, so therefore we're not going to promote it. And so I mentioned this just to highlight that his land, while the American Jewish Committee is going out of its way to promote it, and when I say going out of its way, the Worldwide Pictures contacts the American Jewish Committee saying, you know, you've helped us really get this film out into the public in the United States, but we're having some difficulty abroad. Is there anything that you can do to maybe put in a good word? And Gerald Strober of the American Jewish Committee says, yes, I have several contacts in the UK. I am happy to contact them in advance. So when your letter to them comes, I will have already laid the groundwork. And I'm sure there are several Jewish communities in the UK who would be happy to help now that we have interceded. So this real interesting connection that the American Jewish Committee is going out of their way to promote this. And again, the question is why? And I would argue that, again, the American Jewish Committee isn't necessarily interested in every ideological connection between Jews and evangelicals, but they're interested, and this was not always the case with the American Jewish Committee as an organization that was started as a non-Zionist entity, but by the 1960s, they become Zionists, and they see this as a way to promote Israel, right? Especially in the wake of the 1967 war, when they're concerned that their liberal Protestant partners may not be as supportive of Israel as they thought, right? And this question of real versus perceived definitely comes into play. Now, I wanted to skip ahead And again, looking at different moments of this relationship. So, right, we're skipping ahead, definitely 7 years, depending upon who you ask, a short time, a long time. But in this intervening period, you have not only Billy Graham, you have other evangelicals who are working with Jewish communal organizations to promote Israel. Questions come up in 1973 when you have Key 73, this year-long campaign to promote evangelism. And the American Jewish Committee and other organizations go to Billy Graham, seeing him as someone, can you intervene? We're concerned that this nationwide, international campaign to promote proselytization could affect Jews. And this relationship that started in the 1960s with Jewish leaders and Graham continues, that Graham says, yes, he's not involved in Key 73, this campaign, but at the same time, he sees himself as someone, somewhat of an intermediary. And I should also add that it's during the 1970s where Jews and Baptists specifically see themselves aligned when it comes to questions about what's going on in the Soviet Union, that Baptists and Jews there are being persecuted. And so this is unrelated to Israel. And so Jews and Baptists and evangelicals more broadly are seeing ways that they can work together. Now, of course, what I haven't mentioned, or mentioned very briefly, is the concern about the role of Jews in the end of days. Are evangelicals working with Jews because they see this as hastening the second coming? And some do. And for many Jews, they say, well, I don't think that's going to happen today or tomorrow, so let's continue our work and see what happens. So I mention this, I bring this up, this 1977 National Interreligious Award, because I see it as marking not necessarily that 1977 is this momentous event in Jewish evangelical relations, but rather it's marking or making aware this newfound relationship between Jews and evangelicals. And here I just wanted to briefly look at a draft of Billy Graham's speech that he wants to show it to Mark Tannenbaum, just to get his take on it. So, which is also an interesting idea, right? This idea, he's been invited to this award. Specifically, it's taking place in Atlanta, and it's taking place on the same day that Graham has a crusade, I believe, in Cincinnati. So this is also seen as a marker of Jewish-Christian relations, where Graham can receive an interfaith award from the American Jewish Committee during the day and fly to Cincinnati and give a crusade at night, where he's inviting thousands, if not tens of thousands of individuals to accept Jesus into their lives. Okay, so here we have a very small portion of Graham's speech where he says, and this is how he introduces, right? This idea, he's starting off with this vignette that he says, this is what he wants to do. I had a long and frank talk with the chief rabbi in Israel a few years ago. I had asked him if he believed in the coming of the Messiah, and he assured me that he did. I told him that I too believed in the coming of the Messiah, but that when Messiah comes, we will all recognize that he is Jesus who was on earth once before. The chief rabbi smiled over his cup of coffee and said, of course, that's our difference. It is in the spirit of dialogue that I relate to you my own experience. Okay, so this is how Graham wants to start his speech. Tannenbaum responds, saying, with regard to the text of your address before our National Executive Council, it's an excellent statement, both in content and in spirit. And you can also just see, right, these are Tannenbaum's own markings, these questions of what? Let me think about this again. And he says, I have also taken the liberty of making several editorial suggestions and have proposed 2 inserts relative to the present situation in the Middle East. We'll come back to why this is important in a second. May I respectfully suggest that you omit the reference to the meeting with the chief rabbi on page 1. I suggest that only because this audience of national Jewish leaders will certainly respect everything you say about your personal commitments to Christ, that might perceive 2 or 3 references about evangelizing as taking advantage of them as a captive audience, as it were. In saying that, I hope you accept that my intention is entirely constructive in terms of wanting to help you receive the best possible reception. And it's true. In fact, Graham does remove this from the speech, and he starts it in a different way. So again, Graham didn't need to submit his speech. Tannenbaum, he could have given different suggestions. But again, I think it's interesting, this interplay between these 2 individuals who over the course of their lifetimes become strong allies, if not friends. And I will just one other point of note about this award, that the award given is not just the recognition, but it's an award in the shape of the 10 Commandments. And one thing that Tannenbaum did not note in his comments to Graham is Graham's endorsement of reading of the 10 Commandments in school. This question of church-state separation that the American Jewish Committee fought strongly for, that is a question of, Graham talked about how this was a moral code. So perhaps that's the reason why Tannenbaum doesn't make a mention of that. Or perhaps because they're giving him an award in the shape of the 10 Commandments. But there are individuals who write to the American Jewish Committee after the fact saying, what have you done? You have literally you've had supersessionist theology play out right in front of you. A Jew is literally handing the 10 Commandments to an evangelical. And the American Jewish Committee, their response to these letters that they were receiving and criticism of this said, actually, this is a sign of the future that Jews and evangelicals, that the American Jewish Committee, Billy Graham, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, will be working together specifically in support of Israel. So they do not see this as something negative. Of course, they're the ones giving the award. And here, this idea of, well, why is it so important that Mark Tannenbaum asked Graham after reading his speech, could you say a little bit more about the situation in the Middle East? That's on purpose. Again, the American Jewish Committee views Graham's role in Jewish-Christian relations as being, right, this is someone who has perhaps literally the largest audience in the world, that his political and social capital has risen from the 1950s into the 1970s and beyond, right? You could argue that by the 1970s, in some ways, he's only just getting started from what we know about Graham's career into the late 20th and early 21st century. But Tannenbaum and the American Jewish Committee are very concerned about what's taking place on the same day as the award ceremony, that the UN, or UN Resolution 32.5, follows up on previous resolutions calling on Israel to change the situation that had been created, or has the UN understood to have been created from the 1967 war, right? So the General Assembly stressing the urgent need to achieve a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, expressing grave anxiety and concern over the present serious situation in the occupied Arab territories as a result of the continued Israeli occupation, again, words of the UN, and the measures and actions taken by the government of Israel as the occupying power and designed to change the legal status, geographical nature, and demographic composition of those territories, determines that all such measures and actions taken by Israel in the Palestinian and other Arab territories occupied since 1967 have no legal validity and constitute a serious obstruction of efforts aimed at achieving a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. The UN also calls once more upon the government of Israel as the occupying power to desist forthwith from taking any action which would result in changing the legal status, geographic nature, or demographic composition of the Arab territories occupied since 1967, including Jerusalem. So the American Jewish Committee knew what was coming from the United Nations, and they were hoping that with a further assist from Billy Graham, more positive statements about Israel, that the press from Billy Graham might not change the UN resolution, but it would change public opinion. And this is something, this concern about public opinion and the relationship that Graham and the AJC had, was something that we see over and over again. And in case anyone's thinking it's a one-way street where the American Jewish Committee is looking for good press from Graham, Graham had said more than once that he had never received as positive a reception or as good press than he did from the American Jewish Committee. So they both saw this as a positive relationship, one that suited their own political needs. And following up both Graham's comments and Graham does go on in the speech that he does add more information about the positive role that Israel plays in Israeli society and in American life more broadly. But a few days later, on November 1st, there's immediate action from a number of evangelical leaders in the United States. There's a full-page ad taken out in the New York Times with evangelicals' concern for Israel. And I know the text is rather small, but I've taken some sections out. We, the undersigned evangelical Christians, affirm our belief in the right of Israel to exist as a free and independent nation. And in this light, we voice our grave of apprehension concerning the recent direction of American foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. And then another quotation: while the exact boundaries of the land of promise are open, and really interesting phrase, the land of promise, are open to discussion, we, along with most evangelicals, understand the Jewish homeland generally to include the territory west of the Jordan River. Now, this is significant given, especially in the light of the 1967 war with Israel's acquisition of a variety of territories, that evangelicals are supporting this idea of a greater Israel, of the land that Israel has acquired in the 1967 war. Essentially, they support that, right? So this is a follow-up to what the UN is saying. So it's not just the American Jewish Committee, it's not just Billy Graham, but rather a whole host of evangelicals are publicly coming out in support of Israel, especially at a time when the United Nations American foreign policy is questioning the role of the Israeli government. And this question of US-Israel relations, where does that stand at this time? And we can talk about that. And here, as a way towards conclusion, looking ahead, and again, I've tried to just highlight some moments, and what I haven't included are the moments of tension. They definitely exist, but just highlighting that over the course of the late 60s, 70s, and into the 1980s, that there is a development of Jewish evangelical relations. And here, Rabbi Yehiel Eckstein, co-director of the Interreligious Affairs for the Anti-Defamation League, later to go on to form an organization of Jews and Christians related to Israel, highlights that I am convinced, and this is from 1981, a report that he wants members of the ADL as well as the larger Jewish community in the US to understand why this relationship matters, why it should exist. And he says, I'm convinced that many of the issues which are of concern to us today regarding evangelicals and many of our suspicions were also present just a few decades ago when Jewish liberal Protestant and Jewish Catholic relations got underway. We should remember that within the context of a 2,000-year history of Jewish Christian fratricide and polemic, dialogue is a rather recent phenomenon. Clearly, tremendous inroads have been made as a consequence of that new relationship with mainline Christians. We should not lose sight of the fact that Jewish evangelical dialogue is still in its embryonic stages. As the dialogue matures, however, many of the negative images we have of each other will be broken down, divisive issues resolved, and tensions alleviated. And this really harkens back to the 1969 conference between Southern Baptists and members of not only the American Jewish Committee, but rabbis from all different Jewish movements, where they said, oh, actually, when we talk to each other one-on-one and together, our perceptions completely change. And so Eckstein is further highlighting that. And one more example, in 1984, now we're getting into the age of televangelism. Rose Matzkin, a former national president of Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, is introducing Mark Tannenbaum, right? One of the leaders in interreligious affairs, specifically for the American Jewish Committee. She's introducing him at the 70th Hadassah Convention as the keynote speaker. And Matzkin also affirms this significance of Jewish evangelical relations. But here, I want to highlight something that I think Matzkin says that we haven't heard so far from other individuals. Matzkin, as she's introducing Tannenbaum, she says that I was listening to Jerry Falwell on the TV the other day, and I noticed that he kept talking about American Jews in Israel. He was talking about other aspects of American life, religious concerns, but he kept coming back to American Jews in Israel. And Matzkin argues, and right, these are remarks just as she's introducing Tannenbaum, but I still find them to be very, very significant. She says, because Falwell is so interested in Jews in Israel, it's incumbent upon Jews to thus be interested in what Christians have to say. If Christians are going to be talking about Jews in Israel, Jews need to know this, but also Jews should be concerned, right? This idea of it's important for Jews to know how Christians, what they think about Jews and Israel. Perhaps not at all moments in history, but specifically in this moment, as Israel is becoming more and more of a touchstone in American life, in American religious life. Matzkin is arguing that if there's no other reason for interfaith dialogue with evangelicals, it's to know more about who these individuals are and what are they saying, right? This idea that Jewish life is not just, right? It's this, in some ways, this fundamental argument that Jewish life is not just about Jews. It's about non-Jews as well and who they're interacting with. So with these variety of examples, I hope that I've showed how the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, Hadassah, and other Jewish communal organizations looked to evangelicals as interfaith partners. Again, this is at a moment in US history, post-World War II, late 20th century, when interfaith dialogue is changing, the partnerships are changing. One thing that I haven't talked about is this rightward shift, both within Judaism and Christianity, right? The rise of the Christian right, the moral majority, neoconservatism within Judaism, but all of these different political and ideological changes are taking place, and it's causing Jewish communal organizations to reassess their own needs and how they're going to achieve them. Likewise, Southern Baptists, as well as both other evangelical denominations, overwhelmingly embraced Israel. And the fact that this is happening at a time, right, for many of them, they saw 1967 as a sign of the times, that with the Israel's acquisition of territories after the war, for many evangelicals, this was a sign of what was to come, that the second coming is now the pieces, as one of a famous article, the puzzle pieces are now coming together. It's all becoming clear what is coming next. The suggestion being that the second coming is nearing. And to end with, I want to again highlight that this relationship between Jews and evangelicals was a natural one, that it wasn't unnatural as many other organizations or individuals, Jews and non-Jews, thought that this was something that made sense to the organizations, and it made sense from a political perspective as well as a pro-Israel perspective. And so with that, I will conclude, and thank you very much.
First some questions from the audience here, and then we have a few questions.
Would you go back 20 years to the late 40s? And what were the public reactions of traditional Protestant groups, conservative Protestant groups, to the Holocaust and to the creation? Did they advocate for the creation of the state of Israel with their criminal and with the American government?
So, just for anyone on Zoom, the question going back into the 1940s, how did conservative Protestants approach the Holocaust and the creation of the state of Israel? So here it depends which evangelical denominations we're talking about. When it comes to the Holocaust, there were some evangelicals, specifically evangelical periodicals, who said that the Holocaust happened either because Jews had brought this on themselves, or that it's in God's hands. So if this is what is meant to be, it's what is meant to be. But you also had other evangelical Protestant periodicals coming out and saying that the Holocaust is problematic and looking for ways to end it. But you definitely had a diversity of opinion when it came to evangelicals and their perspective of the Holocaust. And then regarding the creation of Israel, that again, this is also something that it depended. That this was, for the most part, I would argue that evangelicals were supportive, but what did it mean? Just as some Jews were concerned that more conservative or religiously observant Jews were concerned that this is a human-made creation as opposed to something that's coming about, by divine power. So that was the concern. But definitely throughout the 40s, 50s, and by the time you get to the 60s, you have evangelicals who are fully embracing Israel.
Let me just mute this.
So I have two questions. One is, you mentioned this a little bit, but say a little bit more about this comfort or even sense within the committee, the ADL, or the Jewish community as a whole about this relationship. And also moving in the other direction, can you relate it a little bit to more recent convergence and alliance between more right-wing elements in the Jewish community, religiously and politically, with evangelicals?
Sure. So starting with the last question first, I think the 2018 ceremony in Jerusalem for the move of the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem really highlighted the convergence of a more conservative Judaism with evangelicalism. That, for instance, and this is very specific in terms of also how the American government is viewing this relationship, that who is invited to give convocations at the ceremony. You have a Chabad rabbi and you have two evangelicals, right? So this idea of how the US government is perceiving the relationship, if you had looked at 30, 40 years in the past, chances are the US government wouldn't be looking to a Chabad rabbi to give an invocation, right? They would likely be looking to the American Jewish Committee, to perhaps someone, a leader of AIPAC, but highlighting that not only is the shift taking place, but that the US, and right also has to do with that Trump is the president at the time and Trump's own ideologies. But so we're seeing that take place. And I use that as an example for, I think, this culmination of this among Jews in general, not across the board, but this rightward shift. And this is something that I'm looking at in my research as well, how Jews and evangelicals over time, have they become closer together ideologically? Have they diverged? And then the first part of the question was, remind me?
About this sense within.
Right. So yeah, so I would say it's interesting because within the American Jewish Committee, this is where you have commentary. So you have neoconservatives who are leading the forefront of this rightward shift within this Jewish ideological sphere, but at the same time, they're not involved in the day-to-day of interfaith relations. So I would say, on the whole, the American Jewish Committee is very much supportive of this forward momentum with evangelicals. But there's a reason why you have the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, and that these are the two, you could argue the American Jewish Congress to an extent, but there's a reason that these are the two organizations that are leading the way. And it has to do with their own standing within the American Jewish community. And again, I should highlight that they are not representative organizations, that they are elite groups of individuals. And so again, I think this is part of where the tension comes in, where the hate mail, if you will, that the American Jewish Committee and the ADL receive about their efforts with evangelicals, it's fascinating. This idea of, right, even with giving Graham an award, how could you do this? Not only how could you give an award in the shape of the 10 Commandments, how could you even engage with someone like this? Don't you know what you're doing? You are destroying the future of American Jewish life. And so it's really instructive to see these comments to further highlight that, yes, today I talked about these Jewish communal organizations, but much of my research is about the response and how individuals are either working against the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, and others, or trying to understand, right? There's also this concern about Jews, especially in the South. What are you doing? These are individuals we see on a daily basis. Don't make it worse for us. You, as a national organization with your headquarters in New York, you don't know what it's like on a daily basis. And that was the concern. And so there's this tension between overarching goal, but also what happens on a daily basis in the classrooms, in the supermarkets, and how that could be a concern.
Yes, thank you. Most of us, and I know from the Catholic perspective, recognize the validity and importance of Israel on political, national, social dynamics. But evangelicals tend to justify it only on literal biblical interpretation. And I imagine some portion of the Jewish community may as well. Are you familiar? What are the major biblical citations that they're using? Because we know that literal biblical interpretation can be very dangerous. So could you respond to that, please?
Sure. So that's really interesting. So CUFI, Christians United for Israel, actually now the largest Zionist group in the United States, which is really interesting that the largest Zionist group in the US is not Jewish, but it's comprised of evangelicals. And if you go on their website, they have a variety of 1 to 2 pagers, descriptions, explanations. And their explanation on Zionism and Israel is all about the connection of Israel to the Bible, that this is the land of the Bible. So I'm not recalling specific passages from the Bible that they're using, but it is very important to note that this 1 to 2 page document about why Christian Zionists believe in Israel, and not necessarily believe in Israel, but why they say that it's, this is, these beliefs are indestructible. It has to do with the Bible. And so thank you for bringing that up as just a point of that it's not even just rooted in 1967 or this immediate past, but rather this very ancient past.
Could you spell CUFI?
Oh, CUFI, Christians United for Israel.
It seems to me that the Jewish organizations were kind of in denial of the true goals of the evangelicals. That is, they say, "Oh, you know what you are doing, but don't speak about it and to our audiences." Whereas the evangelicals seem to have been displaying. They said, "Okay, you don't want it, but we have our own goal." And it seems like they are talking kind of past each other. Can you comment on that?
Yes. So this is a real problem that, again, after the 1967 war, and this is Rabbi Balfour Brickner, from the Reform movement, gives this speech. And he says specifically of Jewish-Christian relations in the post-67 moment, he says, Jews and Christians are like ships passing in the night, that they are talking to each other, but it's just talking. Where is the engagement? Which is fascinating because this is also at the same time that these dialogues are starting to take place, and you have Jews and evangelicals saying, we're hearing you. We never felt this way before. We've understood everything that you say, and now we have a newfound understanding. I want to take this further. So I think to your question, this idea of these organizations, both as individuals, both as groups, they both have their own agendas, and in some ways for them, it's okay that for Jewish communal organizations, it's okay that that evangelicals are disagreeing or have different ideological beliefs, because ultimately these organizations have become centrist Zionist organizations. They want American support for Israel. How are they going to get it? As long as the American government is supportive of Israeli policies, and the American government is looking to the American people. And who are the American people? The majority of Americans, at least 50%, belong to a liberal Protestant organization as late as 1960. That number has since declined, and the rise of evangelicals has become such a powerful, and sometimes living in the Northeast, that's not something on a daily basis that people are encountering, but politically, ideologically, the rise of evangelicals has become so significant that the American Jewish communal organizations have taken note, as well as the American government.
Yeah, my question was like very much related to some of these questions. I was really intrigued by Rose Maskin's comments about Jerry Falwell. That seemed to me to betoken a kind of continued anxiety, perhaps about like, you know, we need to keep up with what these evangelicals are saying because there could be danger in it. And yeah, so I was just curious about that, maybe how some of these organizations were grappling.
Well, so this is really interesting because what I've been doing for the past few weeks is looking at Hadassah archives at the Center for Jewish History. And there was at the same moment this concern about, and I think not completely connected to evangelicals, but within Hadassah, there's this concern about Jews for Jesus, that Hadassah, that the local chapters, as well as the national organization, had been infiltrated by Jews for Jesus who are going to proselytize and convert other members of Hadassah. So, and this is happening, right? These conversations are happening on a local level, on a national level, and so much so that resolutions are passed that if someone is deemed to be a Jew for Jesus, that they are excommunicated. Hadassah doesn't necessarily use excommunication as the word, but their membership is null and void. There is no discussion, that there can't be back and forth. If Hadassah deems that you have ulterior motives, then you are out, and you are out for good. And the comments from the local chapters are saying, but this is terrible. Some of our best members, we had no idea until they made a flippant remark, and now they're no longer part of Hadassah. And others also were concerned that, yeah, this is really bad. This, right? If it's one person, it could be another. And who knows, by the end, that all of the Hadassah chapters could be overrun with Jews for Jesus. And of course, right, I don't think it's specifically about Jews for Jesus. The number of Jews for Jesus in Hadassah as a whole, we're talking about a very small percentage. But to your point, this concern, right, at the same time that these Jewish communal organizations are looking to partner with evangelicals, there is this fear: to what extent? What if we get too close? And I think the concerns that I found in Hadassah archives really tend to highlight that more than perhaps the American Jewish Committee, where they seem to be full steam ahead. And if there's a problem, we will address it, but there's not going to be a problem because to them, the second coming isn't happening anytime soon. So let's just continue our goals.
Oh, I feel like you've already answered it, but before, when the questions were just starting, so to kind of like, in a whole sense, this is entirely about Zionist Jews. And so is there room in this conversation about the interfaith history of non-Zionist Jews? Or-
Yeah, so no, this is a great question and not something that has been addressed. So the organizations that I have been looking at specifically are these centrist Zionist organizations that for the most part are not taking too much of an ideological stance on the right or the left when it comes to Israel, that they're willing to speak up when they need to, but they're not willing to stake their position in American society, their relationship with the US government by going one way or the other. So these are centrist Zionist organizations, but there's definitely a relationship for non-Zionist, anti-Zionist Jews who are not sure, who criticize and question Israel. And that these are many of the individuals who are at the time in the 60s and 70s writing and calling the organizations. Now they're tweeting and posting and saying that, right, this idea of support for Israel is misaligned, that these Jewish communal organizations have their priorities completely, that they're not aligned to perhaps what many Americans in general and American Jews in general believe. And so I think this question really highlights, again, that by looking at American Jewish communal organizations, and that's only a very small section of my work, that what we can learn is that what are some of the goals? And this is right, this is where these dialogues are taking place, at least in the beginning. They're taking place on an organizational level. So that's instructive for how these relationships began and why. But I think over time that, and this is how I see my book concluding, talking about on an individual basis, how are American Jews responding? And do they see these communal organizations as playing any role in contemporary Jewish life? And if they do, to what extent? So right, again, it comes back to these goals that these organizations have and how they're very specific to their own organizational needs and not necessarily specific to American Jewish communities as a whole.
So there's a question online asking for clarification that ties to the question that was just asked. Who were the organization American Jews in 1967 or around that time who were criticizing or Israeli policies or Israel and not aligning with Israel in 1967 or around that time?
Yeah, so one example that comes to mind is Bray Rock. But this is early 1970s American Jews saying that there is a choice, that it's not this, what they perceived as blind faith, that whatever Israel does, American Jews need to fall in line. That just as Americans, Jews or non-Jews, would question the US government, that it was, well, why is Israel seen as something different, where maybe it's okay if, you know, in quiet circles amongst Jews, you can question it, but publicly, it's not okay to question it. And it's this moment, you know, for my book, I see 1967 as in some ways a watershed moment, and in other ways, that Jewish evangelical relations were happening before and after. So in some ways, I don't focus so much on it, but in the history of American Jewish relations amongst other Jews and also US-Israel relations, I do see 67 as a pivotal moment. So I would say Bray Rock is one example, but you also have not even organizationally, Jews who are concerned about what it means that Israel has acquired territories that it didn't possess, and questions about the individual Palestinians living in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. What does that mean? And what does that mean specifically going forward?
Thank you for this talk. I wanted to in your research on the American Jewish community, if you know about any of their efforts in Jewish-Protestant dialogue, and if you have, if that made attention to that in their minds.
Yeah, and so what was the last part? If that made
Attention that they look at Evangelicals, so their public support that.
yes. So what I have found with the relationship between Jews and Muslims within the American Jewish Committee, that was a later development than with evangelicals. So something that the American Jewish Committee very much today is focused on relationships with the Latinx community, with Muslims. But in the 60s and 70s, that relationship with Muslims was not one of their priorities, that they definitely saw Jewish-Christian dialogue as their forte. And again, Mark Tannenbaum of the American Jewish Committee previously, he was very much involved in Vatican II. So he was well known in terms of his Jewish Catholic relationships. And he becomes this leader in Jewish evangelical relationships. So Tannenbaum himself and the American Jewish Committee as a whole, it's only in the end part of the 20th century where there's this emphasis on, again, and I don't mean to sound crass when I say that it's about numbers, but I do think that these individuals do care about these relationships, these individual relationships that they're building, but it's also to support their agendas. And how can they do that? By partnering with strategic groups. And in the 60s and 70s, one of those strategic groups was Evangelicals.
I will take the opportunity to ask the last question before we part and finish lunch. To what extent the dialogue or conversations or rapprochement with the evangelicals was an extension of the experience of dialogue with the Catholic Church, especially on the heels of Vatican II. You just mentioned Vatican II. So the Berlin Conference takes in 1966. That's a year after Nostra Aetate. So on the part of the AJC, perhaps they saw it as a way to expand, and then to what extent the evangelicals are responding to what is happening with the Catholic Church and the Second Vatican II and the rapprochement with the Jewish community. And then finally, a question about a comment about that. It seems like 1967 and the late 60s are very different from the 70s.
Yeah. So
in that response to rejection or policies maybe of Israel might be different in the 67, 68, even then in 16, even 9 and 70. But
yeah, no, thank you for that. I'm going to try to remember all of the points. So stop me if I don't hit it all. But I think it's really important to highlight. I made some remark before. We're skipping ahead from 1970 to 1977. And in doing so, right, I said, oh, it's only 7 years. But in actuality, 7 years in this very nascent relationship, it's everything. And right, so of course, part 2, I'll talk about 1970 to 1977. But this is true, that the relationship takes on different stages. And I will say that one of the things that makes a difference, especially in the end of the 1970s, is this in 1979, the Southern Baptist Convention, there's this essentially takeover from a conservative faction. So before you had, for the most part, liberal Jews working with moderate evangelicals, and then slowly but surely, all of the denominational organizations associated with this, what is called the Southern Baptist controversy, become more and more conservative. So it's this question of, at this time, who then are Jews talking to? Are they still able to talk to the same partners that they had? And again, I think this is highlighting the shifts that take place. And with this title about realigning faith, these questions about where are Jews shifting, both ideologically, both in terms of Israel, same thing with evangelicals. And then to your point about Vatican II, this is, I'm not so sure about evangelicals. This is something I need to look into in terms of how evangelicals are responding to Vatican II, but I can definitely say that American Jews, American Jewish communal organizations, the idea that Vatican II, to have church policy on Jews, be right, this idea of the role that Jews played in the death of Jesus, that this is something that is standard for centuries, and then having this dialogue and discussion and saying, oh, well, wait a second, if church policy can change, what else can change? And that especially the American Jewish Committee found it so positive that the events from Vatican II, and again, Mark Tannenbaum is intricately involved, that there was this, I would argue, this push as to what's next, right? We've worked with liberal Protestants now, and my work doesn't deal with Jews and Catholics, but the American Jewish Committee, at the same time that they're working with evangelicals, we're also promoting an agenda with Catholics. But right, this really positive and hopeful moment of what's next with evangelicals.
So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Amy, for the talk, and we hope you'll join us for